Our next feature, violence against women and girls. 16 Days of Activism Focusing on Violence Against Women and Girls is a campaign which has just been launched for this year. In Scotland, the campaign was marked with an exhibition at the Glasgow Women's Library, the only such library in the UK, which has provided resources to campaigners since 1991. Glasgow Women's Library GWL say that their vision is of a world in which every woman is able to fulfil her potential and where women's historical, cultural and political contributions to society are fully recognised, valued and celebrated. The exhibition last Saturday, that's the 25th, featured protest placards and posters which activists had made for various recent protests in Scotland. The choice of poster included in the exhibition has, however, been criticised by some women's campaigners for including campaign material from trans activists. So is this part of GWL's inclusiveness policy? Do trans rights fit alongside women's rights? And I'm speaking to this week to Jenny Wilmot, who's a feminist and lesbian campaigner. And we're going to talk about the 16 Days of Activism, which has just begun, campaigning against violence on women and girls. So, Jenny Wilmot, good morning. Good to have you on the show.
Morning. Thank you very much for having me.
A campaign began in Glasgow and indeed internationally last Saturday, I think it kicked off. And this is the 16 Days of Activism. Now, this is focusing on the amount of violence and generally not acceptable behaviour by men against women. Is that what it's all about?
Yeah, it's called the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. It's a UN campaign, and it starts with the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is the 25th of November, and it runs until the 10th of December, which is Human Rights Day.
Yeah, I see. Now, in Glasgow in particular, we have the Glasgow Women's Library, which was established a number of years ago. And I'm looking at the website to see that's actually unique, but it is a for women resource. But they do actually make the point that there's really nowhere else like that in Britain. It's a quite unique and important institution, isn't it? Are you generally supportive of Glasgow Women's Library and their work?
Generally, we would be supportive of a women's library that was for the focus for women and a hub for information about and for women, and that generally promoted women's rights, yes. The Glasgow Women's Library, certainly when it was founded, was all about women. Women were centred. Mm-hmm. Men were allowed to visit, but it was by appointment only. That's not the case anymore.
Okay, so it is exclusively women, but that raises the question of inclusive, because, let's just go to the reason we're talking about them today, because they kicked off the 16 days with an exhibition. Now, they had invited people to send in things like placards or posters that had been used in recent demonstrations for women's rights. Now, many women I've spoken to were surprised by the content of that demonstration. Now, as you said, looking at the pictures on Twitter, I see a lot of posters, not for women's campaigns at all, but for trans campaigns. And I've just read an open letter, which I believe you're involved with, which says that, in fact, the majority of the posters and placards they collect were actually about trans campaigners demanding trans rights. So is that your experience?
Yeah, they certainly, their events programme is about women, and their library generally is set up to be focused on women. But they have what they call an inclusive policy. So when they say women, their definition of women is extremely broad. So it includes men who identify as women, it includes non-binary people, and it includes anyone who is comfortable in a woman-centred environment. So really pretty much anyone. And yes, absolutely, the exhibition on Saturday, we visited it, and the focus was very much on trans rights placards. Now, the placards that were on display are ones that they have actually collected as part of their archive. So it's not just ones that have been brought along by activists. These are ones that they have made the decision to actually collect and save for posterity kind of thing. So the main display in this little exhibition was of trans rights placards. There was a small bit, just a table of placards about the current conflict in Gaza. And there was another display over the other side of the room of placards that had been used in abortion rights protests. So, yes, the focus was very much on trans rights. And actually, we were told by the curator quite a few of the abortion rights placards had been made by an organisation called Cabaret Against the Hate Speech, which is a man, basically.
Yes, now if people are not in Glasgow, I've actually heard this man. He's a cabaret singer. And the reason I've come across this bloke, Tom Harwood, I think is his name.
Tom Harlow.
Is because Harlow. Yeah, I went along last February to a public meeting by Kelly J. Keane. It was a weird event last February. I don't know if you were there, but there was on one side of George Square quite a large number of women, many of whom spoke, and I stayed for a whole 2 hours because it was fascinating to hear what they were saying. But while these women were talking about violence against women, and meanwhile at the other side of George Square, Tom and a lot of young people were doing cabaret songs. Very weird situation. On one side, people were arguing, giving evidence and explaining. On the other side, people were singing ABBA songs. So that's the background to me. It's obvious, though, to me as an outsider, in the feminist movement, there's obviously two views, isn't there? There's a view, as you said, the inclusive one, that women includes men who want to be women. And if you like the traditional view, feminism is actually about women. So there is actually a split, isn't there?
There is, yes. And certainly I run, with my partner Lorraine, an organisation called Scottish Lesbians, and we very much take the view that lesbians are women, that men can't identify into being lesbians. Lesbians have to be female. And yes, there are women who take the opposite view to that men can identify into being lesbians. And so you're right, there is a bit of a split. And Glasgow Women's Library, in focusing on trans rights and putting that kind of front and centre, it really distracted from the work, the really good work that is going on with a lot of groups to end male violence against women and girls. You know, the protest that you spoke about at the Kelly J. Keane event in February, we were there as well. And you're right, it was very much designed to drown out speakers who were talking about violence, about male aggression towards women. And the same group has turned up at other protests. There was one in April where women were trying to see a feminist film at Edinburgh University, and that group again turned up to intimidate women and to try and prevent the film being shown, and actually were successful on that occasion. There's some really quite unpleasant footage of men shoving these signs that Glasgow Women's Library are now displaying into the faces of women to stop them speaking.
Yeah, and that's another issue I wanted to bring up. I know a number of women who attended the very successful Philia conference in Glasgow just about 4 or 5 weeks ago. Now, Philia is an international event which attracted something like 2,500 women to Glasgow. It was a superb event. There was a Glasgow City Councillor inside, I believe, one of the speakers, but also there was 2 Glasgow City Councillors outside protesting. And they were in fact supporters of the guy you're talking about. And he was actually there with his karaoke machine shouting F you at the women as they attended the feminist conference. So you're saying placards have been made by that group, that's an anti-women group. So what are they doing in the Women's Library? Is that your point?
Absolutely. I mean, we were there. We were at the Philia conference. We were there queuing up to go in as he was shouting F you at us and other attendees. And yes, there were Green Party councillors present in the protest. And it was... Well, the First Minister condemned it. You know, it cast Glasgow in a very poor light, that there are women, like you say, many hundreds of women who gathered in Glasgow for a conference to talk about women's rights, to talk about violence against women, to talk about female genital mutilation, all these really important issues globally for women. And there's a man shouting F you at us from across the street. I mean, it was absolutely disgraceful. And I was really pleased that the First Minister condemned it. But yes, this is the group that Glasgow Women's Library has decided to celebrate and to platform on the International Day for the elimination of violence against women.
What we're going to do next week, by the way, I believe you and others have written an open letter to the Glasgow Women's Library, and you're making that point that some of the placards are actually easily be described as anti-women. So you're writing this open letter, and I believe that's going to be public in a couple of days. So we will next week invite the Glasgow Women's Library and make a response. So that's where we are just now, aren't we? So you've looked at the posters and you've said this is not what we expect to find at the start of the campaign.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we asked the curator specifically, are you collecting materials from women's groups on kind of the other side of the divide, our side of the divide, where we're campaigning for women's rights specifically, the gender critical side of things. And we were told, well, she said twice, that our views don't align with Glasgow Women's Library's values, which was just really disappointing. It means that they're collecting one side of the debate. So, yes, we've organised this open letter. We are currently collecting signatures for it, and we're hoping to get that over to them in the next couple of days. And it will be interesting to see what their response is to that.
OK, well, thanks, Jenny Wilmot. And if the Glasgow Women's Library does have a response, we'll get in touch and we'll invite them to explain why they've made that curating choice. But anyway, don't forget, we're celebrating really the start of the 16 days of activism focusing on violence against women and girls. So, Jenny Wilmot, thanks for talking to News for Scotland today.
Thanks very much for having me.
What do you think? Should the Glasgow Women's Library be focusing more on women's issues, and are trans women actually women? Tell me what you think. You can contact us, of course, on the Facebook page, or if you look underneath on the YouTube edition, you can leave a comment there. You can also write to us on info@newsforscotland.org.